Welcome to Unique Video. Remember to like and subscribe for latest videos.
And last night, we aired video from surveillance cameras on Capitol Hill. That video was recorded 26 months to the day before, January 6, 2021. And for 26 months, that footage was held from the American public. The January 6th committee made certain. Now, the Justice Department also kept a lid on that video footage. And in fact, in some cases, DOJ did not share it with criminal defendants who'd been charged on January 6th in violation of their constitutional rights. So we felt it was a public service to bring what we could to you. There was no justification for keeping this secret any longer, and a powerful argument to be made that sunlight is always and everywhere the best disinfectant. And in fact, because it was video evidence, it is to some extent self-explanatory. Anyone can look at the tape and decide what he or she thinks of it. So the tape we showed last night indicated very clearly that Capitol Hill police, in some cases, escorted protesters through the Capitol as if they were giving a tour. They did that with Jacob Chansley, the so-called QAnon shaman. At one point, they even tried to open locked doors on Chansley's behalf. Chansley was sentenced to 4 years in prison for his crimes in the Capitol on January 6th. And the video we showed you last night raises the obvious question, why? On what grounds? The video I showed you last night also showed that Officer Brian Sicknick was not beaten to death with a fire extinguisher by protesters on January 6th, as the media and Liz Cheney so often claimed. The video shows Sicknick walking around the building, apparently in good health, after he was supposedly killed. We showed you that video. You can make of it what you will. We also showed you video that proves Ray Epps, the mysterious protester who encouraged others to breach the Capitol, lied to the January 6th committee about where he was on that day. But for some reason, the committee protected him anyway. He was not considered an insurrectionist. He was their ally. So once again, you can draw whatever conclusions you like from that video. We have ours and we shared them with you. But it's really beyond debate that it is good for this country for Americans to be able to see it. The media and politicians, the people in charge, have talked about January 6th every day since it happened for 26 months. And so at some point, the evidence should be presented to the public. In free countries, governments do not lie about protests as a pretext to gain more power for themselves. They don't selectively edit videos for propaganda services and then lie about them in fake hearings and show trials. But that's exactly what happened. And every member of Congress should ask why that happened. But Democrats in the Senate, the Democratic leader in the Senate, Chuck Schumer, is not asking why. Instead, Chuck Schumer went on the Senate floor today to explode and to say that showing that video, evidence of wrongdoing by the federal government, including the security forces, the police department that Nancy Pelosi personally controlled, letting the public see any of that is a threat to democracy. Watch.
Last night, millions of Americans tuned in to one of the most shameful hours we have ever seen on cable television. Fox News host Tucker Carlson ran a lengthy segment last night arguing the January 6th Capitol attack was not a violent insurrection. I don't think I've ever seen a primetime cable news anchor manipulate his viewers the way Mr. Carlson did last night. I don't think I've ever seen an anchor treat the American people and American democracy with such disdain.
There's nothing that shameful that has ever appeared on American television in the history of the medium. And so, on the basis of that, the self-evident outrage of showing the public video that it paid for and has a right to see, Chuck Schumer called for the censorship of that video. Any information, and he did not dispute that it was accurate, that damages a storyline his party constructed and used must be squelched. And Schumer was explicit on that point. Because that video contradicted lies told by the Democratic Party, Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, Chuck Schumer demanded that our bosses pull this show off the air.
He's going to come back tonight with another segment. Fox News should tell him not to. Fox News, Rupert Murdoch, tell Carlson not to run a second segment of lies. I urge Fox News to order Carlson to cease propagating the big lie on his network. and to level with their viewers about the truth behind the efforts to mislead the public. Conduct like theirs is just asking for another January 6th to happen.
It's a threat to democracy. Pull him off the air. A couple of obvious observations. You don't often see the Senate Majority Leader openly call for censorship on the floor of the Senate, as if that was totally normal and didn't contradict the spirit and the letter of the First Amendment. But of course it does. But what's really happening here, what you're seeing is hysteria, the overstatement, the crazed hyperbole, the red in the face anger. What is that? Well, it's not outrage. Of course, it's fear. It's panic. Those videos, which we did not retouch, which we brought to you after running everyone by the Capitol Police to make certain that we didn't imperil anybody, we told you that last night. Those videos touch a nerve because they're a threat to the lies that Chuck Schumer has been telling for the last 26 months, and not just Chuck Schumer. We should also tell you that Chuck Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader, was joined in this outrage by the Senate Minority Leader, and that would be a Republican, Mitch McConnell. And they were joined by a cascade of other Republicans, Tom Tillis from North Carolina, Mitt Romney from Utah, all sharing the same outrage. And from this, we learn two things. One, you're getting close to what they really care about. And you have to ask yourself, why? Why is it so important that they would degrade themselves by telling such obvious lies and calling for censorship? Why? What are they trying to protect? That might be worth exploring, and we plan to. And the second thing that we learned from this is that they're on the same side. The Senate Majority Leader joins the Senate Minority Leader. Tom Tillis, Mitt Romney. They're all on the same side. So it's actually not about left and right. It's not about Republican and Democrat. Here you have people with shared interests. The open borders people, the people like Mitch McConnell who are living in splendor on Chinese money. The people who underneath it all have everything in common, are all aligned against everyone else. And that would include almost all news organizations in this country as well. And so if you're watching this at home, it might be kind of interesting to keep a list, because one thing we learned today is that they're all in agreement with each other. They kind of outed themselves. They sort of showed their membership cards and whatever club this is to the public. So keep a list. If you want to know who's actually aligned, despite the illusion of partisanship, we found out today. We have a little more tape for you tonight. So if you take 3 steps back, you may notice that the one person really who was never blamed for anything that happened on January 6th was the very same person who was in charge of the police force, the Capitol Hill Police, that was charged with securing safety on January 6th. And that person was Nancy Pelosi. So if there was a security failure on January 6th, and demonstrably there was, that was probably Nancy Pelosi's fault. And after looking at thousands of hours of footage, we came to the conclusion that many others have reached, which is the Capitol Police were not prepared for what happened. And that's fascinating when you think about it, because there was ample warning. The federal intel and law enforcement agencies knew perfectly well there could be a massive disturbance at the Capitol. But the frontline officers on duty that day didn't know. And yet the people who kept that information from the frontline officers who were overwhelmed by thousands of people milling around the Capitol building, the people who fell down on the job, who didn't do their job, they were not punished. They were rewarded. And you have to ask yourself, why is that? Here we go. Federal law enforcement knew perfectly well there was going to be a huge demonstration in Washington on the afternoon of January 6, 2021, and that it could become potentially violent. There is no debate about that fact. The FBI knew. But it's also clear that many on the U.S. Capitol Police Force, the frontline officers who protect the Congress, did not know. They had no idea what was coming. And because they didn't know, they were completely unprepared for what happened that day. That is a very strange failure of communication, and it has never been explained. To understand more about the response to January 6th inside the Capitol, we sat down with a man called Tarek Johnson. Johnson served as a Capitol Hill police officer for 22 years. On the day of the protests, he says he was responsible for securing the certification of the presidential election. If there is anyone at the very heart of the January 6th story, it's former Capitol Police Lieutenant Tarek Johnson. And yet, for some reason, the January 6th committee never called him to testify.
My voice was one of the first ones you hear on the audio transmission. So I did expect to get an interview at some time, but no, it didn't happen. I guess the focus was on Donald Trump.
According to Johnson, no one answered his numerous pleas for help over Capitol Police radio frequencies. Johnson says he, quote, didn't hear anything on the radio. According to Johnson, Yogananda Pittman kept vital information about the protests from frontline officers like him. Pittman was the assistant chief of the department in charge of intelligence operations.
We should have been better prepared that day, and we could have been better prepared that day if the information was disseminated like it was supposed to be.
Once protesters moved inside the building, Johnson's first concern was the safety of senators. His job was to protect them. In rising panic, he called over the radio for direction and assistance. Even now, 2 years later, he is baffled by the response he got.
I was requesting permission to evacuate the Senate side, the Senate chambers, because I had a clear line of sight to get them out the Senate door, and I didn't get permission. The dispatcher called a couple times to see if I can get permission. No response.
With Yogananda Pittman and his other supervisors unresponsive, Johnson says he decided to begin the evacuation of senators himself.
The person that I thought was going to authorize the evacuation didn't do it. I wanted to get those members of Congress out as quickly as I could. That's why I initiated, those evacuations. Me being disciplined, it wasn't as important as not getting the members of Congress and their staff to safety.
Footage we reviewed seems to bolster Johnson's account. The video shows Johnson conducting the evacuation of senators from the chamber. Yet Tarek Johnson was not rewarded for what he did. He was punished. A photo emerged of Johnson wearing a MAGA hat outside the Capitol. That picture cost him his career.
Sometimes I look at it and like, thank you, God, for blessing me with this hat. And sometimes I'm like, wow, I wish this hat never came in my life.
A Biden voter, Johnson says he donned the hat in an effort to rescue fellow officers he believed were trapped in the building.
I figured if I had the hat on, it'll be easier for me to navigate my way through the crowd. It was basically self-preservation and de-escalation, and I needed to get up those steps. I couldn't say what would have happened walking through that crowd without it.
But for the crime of wearing a Trump hat, Johnson found himself suspended. Ultimately, he resigned from the force and lost his pension. He now works part-time as a furniture mover. Yogananda Pittman, meanwhile, thrived. 2 days after January 6th, Nancy Pelosi elevated Pittman to acting chief of the Capitol Police. Late last year, Pittman took a high-paying job as the head of security at UC Berkeley, which is right outside Pelosi's congressional district. Berkeley announced Pittman's hiring with unqualified praise for her, quote, steadfast commitment to social justice. Pittman herself boasted about her heroic performance on January 6th. Her department, she said, quote, saved democracy that day. We reached out to Yogananda Pittman for comment, but she didn't get back to us. Tarek Johnson spent 22 years as a Capitol Police officer. On January 6th, he says he was in charge of securing the certification of the presidential election. So he was right in the middle of it. If anyone was, Tarek Johnson was. Here's more of our sit-down interview with him. Mr. Johnson, thank you for joining us.
And thank you for having me.
So from the outside, here's how it looked. We now know that huge parts of the federal government were aware that there was going to be something big happening at the Capitol on January 6th. They knew there were going to be big demonstrations there, and they prepared for that. But the Capitol Police, on which you served for 22 years, did not seem prepared at all. And of course, that would be the front line in preparedness. Was the Capitol Police prepared for that day?
The frontline officers and supervisors were not prepared for that at all.
When you say it all, so you had no idea it was coming?
We knew that there was going to be a demonstration that day, but we had no idea that we were going to be facing what we faced on that actual day.
So things start to fall apart. People stream in the building. You call upwards in the command chain, help me. You don't get a response. What do you do next?
So around 2 o'clock, it may have been a little bit after 2 o'clock, I hear a officer say that the Capitol was breached. So I ran inside of the building. I ran, to assist. I knew that that location of where that first breach occurred was near where the members of Congress would be locked in. We initiated a lockdown, so that means the chamber doors on the Senate side and the House side were locked. So that means the members of Congress would be safe inside those locked rooms.
Yes.
So I ran over to the House side first to make sure that those doors were locked. Then I ran over to the Senate side to make sure those doors were locked. So I asked over the radio and I say something to the effect that we need direction. We have hundreds of people inside of the building. What do you want us to do? We need some direction. I heard no response. No response. So, at that particular time,
How could nobody respond?
nobody responded.
At some point, you put on a MAGA hat.
Yes. Now,
I think we have it. I think we have the actual MAGA
yes,
hat.
we actually do have the mega hag. I have it here in plastic. So here it is. Want to take it? Yeah.
J6, it
Yes.
says.
Yeah, I labeled it J6.
So tell us why you put the hat on and how that was related to your suspension.
That's what got me national attention, was the wearing of the MAGA hat. They were officers. We had a distress call that there were approximately 10 or 11 officers, I can't remember the exact number, were trapped at the top of the rotunda steps. So I elicited the help of some CDU officers to help me go up the steps. And I kept yelling that all the way up the steps, giving people high fives, trying to make it up the steps to get to the guys. And as I was going down, there was a demonstrator on, I believe he was on my right side of me. So he reached over. I didn't know what he was doing. I didn't know if he was going to hit me. And he put the MAGA hat on my head. So as I was still trying to walk down the steps, then he asked for the hat back. And I said, well, I would like to keep it because the hat's going to help me.
Yeah, it's your passport through the crowd.
Yeah, exactly.
So the Capitol Police is by definition nonpartisan. It serves both parties in the Congress. It protects members of both parties.
100%.
And it has to be that way. In the wake of January 6th, you saw what looked like partisanship at the Capitol Police. Did you perceive that?
I'm still shocked because as a Capitol Police officer, we even had we had our chief of police at the time. His name was Stephen's son, and he called for all the officers who was at work that day. He called for everybody to come in, and we all went to Emancipation Hall in the CVC, and and this was during the Black Lives Matter demonstrations.
Yes.
And he told us that as Capitol Police officers, we need to stay neutral. We need to stay neutral, period. So we were like, okay, that's what we do. Because we protect Democrats, we protect, Republicans, we protect everybody. So we need to stay neutral. So then after January 6th, you had some police officers who wasn't neutral. It didn't seem neutral.
At all.
Yeah, and that was an issue, yes.
So, that devalues the credibility of Capitol Police, doesn't it, if they're allowed to be partisan in public?
They're supposed to be neutral, period.
Since you were there on January 6th, what did you think of the job of the January 6th committee? Do you think that they were honest in the way they approached it? Do you think they got to the truth?
I prayed almost daily that they would get to me. I was never asked to testify. And if you listen to the radio...
You were never asked by the January 6th committee?
I was never asked by anybody connected to the January 6th committee to testify. I ask myself why every day. And every day I might have a different answer, but I looked at what pretty much they focused on Donald Trump and not the failures of the Capitol Police.
Why do you think they were there?
I think that some people there had planned on being violent. Some people may have turned violent after what they were going through. I think that people wanted to support their president. Some of those people wanted just to support him. And some of those people didn't commit violence, and some of those people didn't plan on it.
We haven't answered every question about what actually happened on January 6th. Far from it. There's so many mysteries from that day. But one thing we know for certain is that the story they told you about it, a pat tale of good versus evil, an insurrection with no guns that took place at the U.S. Capitol, those were lies, and they were lies told for a very specific purpose. Of course, the people in power wanted more power, and they got it on the basis of those lies. But in the process, many lives were destroyed, and some people are still in jail tonight, not having had their constitutionally guaranteed moment in front of a jury of their peers. They haven't even been put on trial yet, and they're still rotting. Julie Kelly is the one journalist in this country who's been following this very closely. She wrote a book on it. January 6th, how Democrats used the Capitol protest to launch a war on terror against the political right, which is a perfect summation of what actually happened. Julie Kelly joins us now. Julie, thanks so much for coming on. So it dawned on us as these tapes made very clear that the story we've been presented is an absolute fabrication. It's a lie. It's a fraud. That people may still be in jail on the basis of these lies. And so we wanted to talk to you for an update on where those cases are tonight.
So, yes, there are, at least 100 men have been held under pretrial detention orders over the past 2 years. That means that a judge has denied them bail because the government, DOJ, successfully argued that that individual was a threat to the community. This includes, Tucker, people charged with nonviolent offenses like obstruction and conspiracy. So, of course, they don't have access to what could very easily be exculpatory evidence contained in this video. But aside from the now, I think, around 36 men who are held under pretrial detention orders, Tucker, believe it or not, there are some men going on 24, 25, 26 months denied bail, languishing in jail, including the D.C. gulag, as the government continues to delay their trials. This all has the imprimatur, by the way, of every judge on the D.C. District Court. I want to emphasize the real villains here are the federal judges in Washington, D.C., who have allowed the government to play every single game to keep this evidence out of the hands of defendants, violating their oath of office to protect the rights of defendants and their due process rights. So I really want to emphasize that. But look, Tucker, there's 1,000 criminal defendants right now. Half of them have pleaded guilty or been convicted at trial. So, and the government just announced 2 months ago in January that they were still uploading global, they call it discovery, which means material related to the entire investigation. What they did was arrest people first, find the evidence later, and cover up what could potentially exonerate these defendants.
If this were happening in any other country, the U.S. State Department would immediately acknowledge that these were violations of the most basic human rights. These are political prisoners. And the U.S. government would condemn it. But it's happening here, and it's ignored, except by you. And I so appreciate your tireless reporting on this. Julie Kelly, thank you.
Thank you, Tucker.
So as far as we know, for more than 2 years, no one in our vast and well-funded media landscape demanded to see the footage that we have been showing you. Footage that was shot with your money on cameras that you paid for on public property that technically you own. So we did, and we got it, and we're proud of that, I guess. It's kind of a basic function of journalism. But now that we have done that, well, of course, we've committed some crime, say the media.
Carlson attempting to downplay the violence by showing video of people calmly walking around the Capitol. And Tucker was trying to persuade his viewers that while there were some bad apples, most of those there were peaceful.
Right. Showing you the video. Can you imagine? Ignore your lying eyes. MSNBC has the truth on tap. Well, as far as we know, for more than 2 years, 26 months to the day, actually, no media organization in the country pressed to see the actual tape, the January 6th surveillance footage. And there was a reason for that. So a small group of people, which would include the leaders of the Democratic Party and their allies in the media, had a complete monopoly on what you were allowed to know about what happened, what actually happened in the Capitol on January 6th. And they defended that monopoly with great ferocity, as monopolists tend to do. So the moment we broke that monopoly, simply by getting access to the footage, it's not hard. That's what you're supposed to do when you work in the news business. Other media outlets went crazy. They all did. And we just couldn't resist, not to be self-referential, but it's too hilarious. So we assembled a montage. Here it is.
What we saw tonight, Allison, from Tucker is nothing new. He has been trying to sanitize the very real violence that we all saw unfold at the U.S. Capitol.
41,000 hours of footage from an attempted coup is federal evidence. How on earth is Kevin McCarthy trying to justify the fellow members of Congress giving 41,000 hours of federal investigative evidence and material to Fox News?
This is the danger of not fairness, unfairness. You should give it to every news organization at the same time.
What's next? Is the Speaker of the House going to turn over the daily schedules of the Capitol Police? Are they going to give them the codes to the locked doors?
Nobody that believes any of that garbage Tucker was spewing, none of their kids will ever believe that garbage.
It feels like a Soviet system, or, you know, the way the Nazis would build a Potemkin village. Tucker Carlson's doing the same thing with the footage from 1/6.
Footage. We're both Soviet and Nazi. What you're hearing, of course, is panic. It's fear. A hurt dog barks. But it's still pretty funny. Steve Krakauer covers the media for a living, really better than anyone else. He's the author of Uncovered. He joins us tonight. Steve, thanks so much for coming on. I think I'm getting kind of old, but I thought the whole point of the news media was to get evidence and bring it to viewers or readers and let them assess for themselves, like in a country full of adult citizens. But no?
You would think so. I'm sorry. Did Don Lemon say this is the problem with fairness? I think that
it's so great.
Tucker, look, this is, as you mentioned, a total panic episode that we're watching in real time, flailing by the corporate press. Because, yes, for years now, as you mentioned, over 2 years, they've crafted a narrative that really is a house of cards. No one really believes that what the media portrays, which is that this is just another 9/11, the worst attack since the Civil War. No one actually believes that. I mean, you look at poll after poll of the January 6th committee, which really was in partnership with the media. I mean, they actually had a former media executive, an ABC executive, craft the committee's videos that you saw. I mean, it was a total partnership, and yet it didn't move the needle at all. No one was swayed by the total sham that we saw from the January 6th committee. And so now, yes, you would think a media would be curious about lots of elements of January 6th, like, you know, who planted the bombs outside the DNC and the RNC, and the massive security failures, as you mentioned, which was one of the elements that the January 6th committee did look into, as we now know, but was kept out of the final report because they decided to make it all about Trump. You would think that maybe they'd be curious, or at least any rational person might be curious about Ray Epps, which, you know, someone who was a leader of the Oath Keepers and was buddies with Stuart Rhodes, and is the only person on video on January 5th night and January 6th morning encouraging people to go into the Capitol, and he's getting glowing profiles in the New York Times. Like, someone should say, what is going on? Why is this happening exactly? And so, no, in the service of the narrative, a narrative that no one really in the country is believing, this is the panic we get.
Yeah. Everybody's on the same team. I mean, you would think, like, the conventional way to see it is left versus right, Republican versus Democrat. Well, if that's true, why is the New York Times doing like a 9-part series on how Mitch McConnell got so much money from China? They would never do that because he's on their side. It's so great. It's all very obvious now. Steve Krakauer, great to see you tonight. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Tucker.
Well, it turns out the same people, the same media outlets that lied to you for over 2 years about January 6th, it was a dangerous insurrection, have been telling you that we have to spend a lot more, billions more, on the war in Ukraine forever. And if you don't agree, well, you work for Putin. Now they're saying we need to supply F-16s to Ukraine. It's insane, of course, and it is fundamentally a core tenet of neoliberalism that controlling the internal affairs of other countries matters a lot more than improving the lives of your own citizens. What's amazing is how many Republicans in this country, as if you need more evidence, everyone's on the same side, agree. Here's Senator Dan Sullivan of Alaska.
You know, on the F-16s, I hosted several Ukrainian pilots last summer in Washington, D.C. We were pressing for F-16s. I sent a letter to the Secretary of Defense, to General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. It looked like it was moving forward well within the bureaucracy of the Pentagon. The president gets off a helicopter a couple months ago, says no. And then last week, the National Security Advisor says, well, we're not going to do F-16s for now. Well, that's exactly the wrong approach, George.
So what's interesting here is that no one is representing what the majority of Americans want, which is peace. The majority of Americans do not want to be in a hot war with Russia, not because they're pro-Putin. They don't like Putin, because they don't think a war like that would benefit the United States. But the Republican Party, its leaders, and the Democratic Party, its leaders, disagree. They don't want any limits on any kind of military hardware we might send to Ukraine. And they don't care about the consequences of that decision. What's interesting is there's been almost no debate on this publicly at all. But there is a presidential race coming up. So now's the time to find out what people really think. And by the way, good people can disagree.